from Genspect. We're just waiting for all our participants to file in. We have a great response today for this webinar. So just take a minute here as everyone files in. I'm the director of Genspect USA, and we're offering a lot of different webinars to help continue our advocacy and educating around a healthy approach to sex and gender, as well as different topics and issues going on with counseling and medical care. So just everyone kind of get comfortable as we get our participants filing in, and we will introduce our great panelists here. So as I said, I'm Dr. Carrie Mendoza. I'm the director of Genspect USA, and today I'm very excited to have this webinar, How Identity-Driven Narratives Impact Mental Health Care. We've got this great panel, and I'm gonna pass it over to Sally Satel, who's gonna run the discussion. She's a well-known psychiatrist, an AEI fellow, an incredible author. And I've worked with her doing several educational events. And so I'm really excited for her to run this one. So I'll pass it over to you, Sally, to continue the introductions and start the discussion.
Thank you, Carrie. Well, I've been following politicized science and medicine for a long time, at least 2.5 decades. And there's no question in my mind that the climate is far worse now than ever before. It's more systemic, it's more systematic, and it's more virulent. This is true in medicine. And when Carrie was at Fair for All, we did some seminars on that. But today we're going to talk about mental health, the mental health arena. We've got great panelists today. I'll just preview this. I'm not even going to give you examples of what I'm talking about because the panelists will, but I'll just sum up what you're about to hear, which is how the helping profession, the talking therapies, basically, or talking therapists, are now practicing what I think we would all agree, all 3 or 4 of us, is really the antithesis of responsive and responsible therapy. It's really quite dramatic. So to learn more about the corruption of therapists' training and the implications for patient care and potential remedies, I'm going to introduce 3 people who are more immersed in this topic, more outspoken, more eloquent, and actually more effective. They're all doing something than I know. So I'm going to hear first from Leslie Elliott Boyce. She is an independent coach and consultant in Washington State. Leslie studied mental health counseling in graduate school. She'll tell you a bit about that. And she hosts programs about the ideological capture of mental health care on her YouTube channel and her podcast, which is called The Radical Center. Next will be Susanna Alexander, who was, notice the past tense, was a student in the University of Tennessee's Counseling Master's Program. That ended last year. I'll just say there were complications. Suzannah is actively working to raise awareness about the harmful nature of the current counseling curriculum and the structural problems in the field. And finally, Andrew Hartz, psychologist, a practicing clinical psychologist in New York City, was formerly a professor in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Long Island University, where he completed his PhD and his internship at Columbia University. He is the founder of the Open Therapy Institute. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor. And they will all speak for about 7 minutes or so. Then I'll maybe ask some questions. We'll have another go round, and then there will be time definitely for Q&A. We're also posting links to their websites and Substacks and new initiatives. So I'll start with you, Leslie.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for having me in for this webinar. I'm really honored to be speaking to your audience. I entered a clinical mental health counseling program in 2019, and I chose this program because it was close to my home. I lived in Seattle, and it was KCREP accredited. It seemed like a good program. I went to an info session at the school prior and spoke with some students and faculty about it, and I was impressed with the program, with what they had to say about it. They had a strong social justice mission statement that didn't raise any alarm bells for me at the time, because I didn't know that social justice was a term that I have come to understand now very differently than my impression at that time. What I found when I entered the program was that counselors were being trained not to be objective and neutral with their clients, but rather to see themselves as agents of social change, and to see their clients as opportunities for education and imprinting a particular social and political ideology. We were explicitly taught that our main role as therapists was social justice activists. We were taught to assess ourselves and our clients according to a tool for identifying privilege and marginalization. That one of the tools that we were given was the addressing model, which is basically a list of demographic categories that we were to plug ourselves into: age, disability, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, nationality, and gender. And then we were to come up with an overall score for ourselves of marginalized or privileged. And we were supposed to do the same thing for our clients. And then we were supposed to act with our clients based on whether we were a privileged counselor talking to a privileged client, a marginalized counselor talking to a marginalized client, privileged to marginalized, etc. And if one of the two is white and the other is what they call BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, person of color, then the race was the deciding factor, and the white person was always privileged and the BIPOC person was always marginalized. So we were also taught as counselors that we were to broach race early on in the clinical relationship, preferably in the first session. This is where you're to say, how does it feel for you as a person of color to be sitting with a white counselor, or something along those lines. If you're white to white, you're supposed to talk about whiteness. If the client had what was considered what they called a low racial identity salience, which means that race didn't factor very heavily into their conception of their problems or their life, then we were to increase their racial identity salience. So we were to work to help them understand how white supremacy or systemic racism had impacted them, had contributed to the problems that they were experiencing in life, or how they were perpetrating white supremacy against people of color if they were white. So this was our mission as social justice, multiculturally competent counselors. We were shown in class, we were shown humorous memes making fun of white people. We had faculty call white women Becky's, basic bitches, nothing special, and saying that their tears were overvalued. So this was the quality of the racial education that we were receiving in a graduate applied psychology program. We were told to degender everything. And this meant that instead of saying mother, father, you're supposed to say parent. Instead of saying brother, sister, you say sibling. And we were to affirm transgender children. We were shown videos and documentaries that were sympathetic to transgender people and instructed us that transgender people had always existed, and that not to affirm a transgender person or to reject a romantic or sexual partner because they come out as trans or had concealed that they were trans would be traumatic and harmful to that person. The school referred to women as AFAB, people with vulvas, and instructed us to always introduce ourselves with pronouns and ask other people for their pronouns during introduction. The school administration also sent out frequent political emails that told us how to think and act in response to current events like gun control. One of the emails said our country has become a killing field and told us to advocate for gun control. January 6th, the war in Ukraine, and the concept of trans misogynoir, I believe is how you would say that, but it was a very popular thing for the school to talk about trans misogynoir, which is the intersection of harm done to trans people who are also trans women who are people of color and LGBTQ advocacy. So this was all very heavy in the program while I was going there, but I was managing to get through my coursework. And it interestingly, there were a couple of courses where this kind of multicultural, this is what they call multicultural content. All the stuff that I just described was very heavy. And some courses where we were receiving what seemed more like a classical counseling education, according to what I expected as a therapy client and as a person who was interested in entering this profession. But the information that we were getting from the school was very heavily based in this social justice ideology. So the communications that we were getting from the administration, some classes, it was a mixed bag really in my classes. But eventually I guess it was 2022, I came up against a civility pledge that was, I took a required course, and my first assignment was to go and post on the class forum for everybody to see that I agreed to the civility pledge. So this was all the students' first assignment for this particular class. So I went to go find out what the civility pledge is, and I found it hidden in the administrative fine print in our syllabus. I don't know how long it had been there. I had not noticed it before, but there was this social justice pledge that told us that we had to pledge to be examining our privileged and marginalized identities along with a host of isms. And I felt really uncomfortable with this, and I couldn't in good conscience sign this pledge or post that I agreed with this pledge. So I withdrew from the course because I felt that if I were to state that I disagreed with this, I would have faced consequences and been on the wrong side of the teacher. And I signed up for the same course in a subsequent semester with a different professor and had the same pledge. And at this point, I became concerned. What is going on? I don't want to sign a pledge like this. So I contacted my faculty advisor, and what she told me was that they were aware that this social justice ideology was very heavy in the program, that I could only expect it to increase. And if I didn't like it, I should get through the program as quickly as possible. And that faculty discussed openly among themselves that they know that they're no longer training counselors who are going to be able to work with the Trump supporter. So this was really quite shocking to me, because as counselors, you should be able to see anybody regardless of political affiliation. And to my knowledge from from what I'd heard in the program, the Trump supporter just meant anybody who didn't agree with completely all of the things that the school was promoting. So, I didn't consider myself to be a Trump supporter, but I would have been lumped into that category for disagreeing with some of these things. So it was a very, that was almost a, it was almost like an ideological label, not necessarily a particular fan of a particular politician. So I had largely completed my coursework at that point, and I felt that I couldn't go forward with more courses if I had to sign a pledge in order to do so. I tried talking with the faculty. I tried filing a grievance. My grievances were rejected. I started to put out videos on YouTube about this because I thought other people needed to know that this was happening. And in response to my videos, 3 things happened. 1, my student account was suspended by the school. 2, the school sent a memo out to all students and faculty, except for me, because my student account was suspended, calling me a white supremacist and a transphobe, and offering crisis assistance to anyone who had seen my videos and warning everyone else not to watch them. And the 3rd thing that happened was I received a deluge of messages from students and professors at other counseling programs who were seeing the same thing. This was from people in the United States, in the UK, in Canada, just really across a wide span. I was getting a lot of feedback that this was going on just about everywhere. So it wasn't specific to this one little program. And I began to invite people to record conversations with me if they wanted to share their own perspective and their own story. And that project has been going on for a little over a year and a half now, I suppose. And so that's my YouTube channel. It's the Radical Center. And we have conversations about this. But the main takeaway from this is that therapists are not being trained to remain ideologically neutral. At the same time, as much of the stigma has been removed from seeing a therapist and more people are going to therapy and sending their children to therapy, and this is a service that many people have come to rely upon, social justice therapists have no specific designation that sets them apart. And something that we all think of a certain way may not be what we expect, whether you're trying to receive services from this field or whether you're someone who's interested in working in this field. It is not what it used to be.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a very disturbing, but very cinematic portrait. Thank you. And now to add to it, Susanna Alexander. Thanks, Susanna.
Hi. Well, my experience, and I do also want to thank you for inviting me to this group and to present my story here. I appreciate that. And I do feel like it is quite an honor. But my story is fairly similar to Leslie's in a lot of ways. I mean, I went into my program not recognizing the weight of what was behind the social justice aspects to it. I had had some bad experiences in the past. I had been part of a Unitarian Universalist church that I had thought was going through something that was specific to that church, which was very politically motivated. And I ended up leaving on, frustrated terms from that group. So I guess in some ways I had had a bit of a heads up that there's something going on there, but my belief was that it was localized in that particular group. So when I saw some similarities in the program that I was a part of at UT, I was concerned, but I didn't take it as an immediate alarm. I mean, there were some little things that came up that just kind of, ticked off some markers in my head. Like one of the professors talked about J.K. Rowling and how she was a tainted figure. That was a bad person to like their work or that sort of thing. And in another class, there was talk about aspects of the Tennessee law related to counseling, and these were characterized as bad laws. And in Tennessee, there is a clause where if you are treating someone and you don't feel like you can adequately support what it is that they're doing, you can recommend that they go to another counselor. And it was characterized in class as this is a way for people who were anti or transphobic to get rid of transphobic clients or LGBT, any other LGBT group. And so this was seen as a very negative and bad law. And there was also a considerable amount of talk about how in Tennessee there was a strong Christian element that in counseling that was so bad that our professional organizations have split into multiple state organizations. And despite all of these things in the program, they would also, in our early orientations, they kind of warmed us up to this environment by saying that to think of this as a brave space where we can and should be open about our experiences. They had the previous year's class come in and talk to us, and they related how they knew each other's trauma before they even knew each other's favorite color, that sort of thing. And there was a strong emphasis on making sure that we would be open and be vulnerable about our feelings and our past, particularly if, we had done something that was, maybe seen as mildly racist or something like that. We were encouraged to be really open about these things and to tell each other. We were also encouraged to be open to the feedback of others. And as part of the curriculum, there are these chorus values, and these were the values that we were supposed to be learning about and, trying to live up to. And the one that, looking back on it, was the biggest red flag was the self-awareness. And we were told, and we were warmed up to the idea that it was important to listen to feedback, and that in many cases, other people's vision of us was more insightful than our own vision. We were encouraged to recognize that we didn't even know ourselves very well. What there wasn't was a balance there where we could have boundaries and say, hey, maybe I don't agree with what your feedback is. We were just encouraged to take in whatever feedback was coming in and, do that without criticism or, really having anything to say about that, and speak for ourselves. Later on in the program, when I started having trouble, that really came up. If I was to say something in response to getting feedback that I didn't agree with, that I was being defensive, which put me in the position of not being able to defend myself without, validating those criticisms that I'm being defensive, and I was, in the context of that, I was called both transphobic and racist because of my Buddhist practice. I had brought that up in an early group activity in our class when we were talking about ways that we could manage our feelings if we were working with a client that we found particularly difficult. The central practice of Buddhism is what they call the doctrine of the non-self, where you work to reduce your focus on your identity. And you can add to that the meditation of loving kindness, where you try and channel your actions in a way that are in line with what your values are. So it's a way of trying to mentally organize yourself in a way that instead of being reactive, you can be more proactive. And I was called out immediately after that class by the professor, who told me that that kind of thinking was invalidating to other identities. And I later heard from two other professors that, this was definitely a questionable practice, because it might not take into not take into account other people's identities enough, or I might not be thinking about my own identity enough. And I was in later meetings, as the semester progressed, I ended up in what was a support situation, after there were some problems in my small group. And I was in those places encouraged to think about my identity and my whiteness more. And there was even one assignment that I was given where I was told to write up different pros and cons about color blindness and gender blindness with relation to that Buddhist practice. And by the end of that semester, in my opinion, it got quite abusive in those support meetings. The faculty were repeatedly asking me if I was suicidal, not in a way that felt concerning, but more in a way that it felt like trying to suggest to me that I should be suicidal, or that my behavior was somehow suggesting that I was suicidal. and just repeatedly being asked if I was suicidal, I found manipulative and pressurizing. So when I was presented at the end, despite the fact that I was basically an A student, that I was not going to be allowed to advance to practicum, which would mean my degree would take a minimum of an additional year. If there was a point at which they decided that I had learned their values well enough, I pulled out of the program, and I was, mentally an absolute disaster after that for quite a while. But in the process of working through that, I started to dig into what is, how did a field which is supposed to be about reaching people across divides, it's about being empathetic to different people despite our differences, turn in to this. And the what I turned up, and this is all from, what was publicly available on the major organizational websites for counseling, like the American Counseling Association, Chi Sigma Iota, and KCREP. All of this information was just out there. And I dug into the history, and that's when I found out that there are documents going back to 1988. There was a large organized get together of, I guess you would call them the elites of counseling. It was the heads of the ACA, those same organizations, KCREP and Chi Sigma Iota, the licensing boards, all getting together to come up with what they thought was a plan for the future of counseling. And the way that they saw it, and I've written a couple of articles about this for Minding the Campus. There's one in particular that talks about the history, and then another that talks about how this is playing out right now. I've got some others coming up. But what the plan was that what?
No, I was about to say, since we have to get to Andrew, then this is the key part that I want everyone to hear. Can you either do this briefly, or can we come back to it in the Q&A?
I guess I can do it briefly, real quick.
All right, and then we can elaborate. But yes,
Yeah.
please make it condensed, and then we'll come back to it, because this is the core part.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, the in very quick terms, what happened is counseling decided that it needed to have a more focused identity to distinguish it from psychotherapy or from social work. And as part of that, they made the decision to encourage all counselors to take on multiculturalism as a value, and all clients to take it on as a value. And that second one is against what is the current ethical code, but it has never been formally disavowed by the profession. Though in later documents, there were a number of these get-togethers where they have, tried to scrub that from the record. The practices have still encouraged things to go in that direction. And it's just kind of spiraled since then. But that's all. That's the short version of that, the little thumbnail. And I could pass the baton to Andrew now.
Okay. Thank you so much. And that part is so to me, so important, the history. What are the roots of this? So we will get back to that for sure. And I also want you to tell folks about the whistleblowing activity. So thank you for the initial case study, and then we can pull back. Andrew Hartz, thank you. Next.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, as most people who've heard these stories, I mean, it's just astounding what's happening in training programs. And I've had similar experiences too. I think the thing that, just to kind of pivot a little bit, the shocking thing is people are having these experiences in other disciplines. They're having this experience in medical programs. They're having this experience at universities. of just this really aggressive ideology that kind of forces people to conform. They're attacked for their beliefs. They're forced into these worldviews that are often hateful to them for their values or their race or their gender. I know somebody who was at a financial firm, a large national financial firm, and they get accused of bias. And even though they get exonerated, they can't get promoted there. I know somebody who's at a law school who got accused of sexual assault, totally exonerated. They found text messages of the accuser where she admitted to making it up. He sued her for defamation, won, still couldn't get employed at a law firm. This stuff is everywhere. And it's in media jobs, it's in education jobs, it's in tech jobs. And the sad thing about it to me is the helping professions and psychotherapy could be helping address these problems, supporting these people, raising awareness about what's happening, formulating what's happening, providing resources. People are really desperate for it. I don't think that's just individual psychotherapy. A lot of people want groups, they want retreats and community-based stuff and other resources, crisis help. What do I do when people are trying to get me to apologize for something I don't think that I should apologize for, or people want me to resign, or they're coming for me? What do I do? People, they deal with it alone most of the time. There's not literature on these things. I was just reviewing a scale that was just created. It just came out 2 years ago. It's the racial trauma scale that they just published in the journal. And it's explicitly only for racial trauma for non-white people. They just don't care about racial harassment or bullying or attacks when they're directed at white people. One of the items on the questionnaire is, in response to racial trauma, are you now avoiding white people? The questionnaire presupposes that the attacker is always white. That's how thick the bias is in the field. And there are tons of people who have experienced anti-white attacks and bullying and hatred and bias and life problems, and the field just refuses to write about any of it. So it's not just how awful some of these trainings are and how awful some of these programs are. It's all the things the field isn't doing to help that are so needed. I could go on and on about that, but I'm going to try to be succinct and get on to questions. Should I say more, Sally? Or?
Oh, please, yes.
Okay. Well, I think that I'll say this then too. There are most therapists who are in private practice right now. If you ask them if they're biased, they're going to say no. Probably maybe 100% would say no. And there are a lot of people who really don't adhere to the social justice model. I don't want to paint the picture that everywhere you go to find a therapist, they're going to scream at you about race in the first session, because I don't think that's an accurate picture. But they're coming from these places. They have to get through these programs. This is where they're trained. And the likelihood that they're really oblivious about large swaths of human experience is really high. If you go online to look for a therapist in New York, last I checked, a majority of them, right after their name, the first thing is their pronouns. They have no awareness of the types of political signals that's sending to potential patients. They think they're being inclusive of trans people. They don't think I'm signaling adherence to an ideology that a lot of patients might not agree with. They might be detransitioners. They might have a kid who's gender questioning and they want help with that. They might have religious values where they disagree with that ideology. Or they might just be a cop and they think because you're on board with that ideology, you're probably on board with defund the police or other things like that. But therapists are totally oblivious to the signals that they're sending on the first thing in their bio. So throughout the session, there's assumptions and biases and missteps that are happening constantly, large and small, from like a tendency to a lot of therapists don't ask about religion in the intake. It's the most important thing in a lot of people's lives. They don't even ask about it. I didn't have a lecture on religion in my entire PhD program. You've got just topics that they avoid. Maybe there's a subtler biases like idealization of victimhood or cultivation of victimhood that I think therapy can easily slip into. So there's just tons of biases, large and small, that I think have taken over the field. And these worst case scenarios, they're important because it gives a barometer of the field is really going off the rails in terms of bias. But the problem is so much bigger than that. It's all these subtle biases. It's all the overlooked issues. It's all the people they aren't helping, the research that's not being done. Could be about, transgender medicine was another place where there was just obviously the field just went along with an activist agenda and didn't do its due diligence. But there's tons of stuff like that. So
And you're developing an institute to try
thank you,
to
Sally. Yes, and that's what the Open Therapy Institute does. Is it's trying to improve care and resources and research and training on all those overlooked issues to kind of correct bias and get better resources to all these groups.
yeah. Thank you. So between all three of you, you've really communicated, I think, a very, very, frankly, harrowing portrait of the way the field is going. Of course, one of the questions that, in fact, I want to ask you guys, because I'll ask the first question, but is really how much of a silent majority is there out there just twisting, too afraid to say anything, and just dying to get into private practice, so they're out of university mental health systems or public systems where this kind of ideology may be more pervasive. So that's one thing I want to ask, but I'll just summarize for everyone when I said earlier that I think honestly this is malpractice, and I know Suzanne will. I know that what she approached a congressman, I believe, at some point. Presenting him with this state of affairs. But when you think of it's just the absolute mirror image of everything therapy should be. Therapy is, as Leslie mentioned, focuses on the individual. It's the ultimate personalized medicine. And here, this whole orientation is seeing the patient as basically an avatar of a group, and almost always a victim group, but not necessarily, because if you go I know some of this almost sounds too hard to believe, like a caricature, but if a couple were to go into couples therapy, then depending on if you're unlucky enough to get a therapist who's steeped in this, then you as the man are immediately suspect. You're the toxic masculinity dynamic in the relationship, and so there's no openness to exploration, or as again you mentioned, Leslie and Suzanne, kind of caring, hovering neutrality. I think that was Freud's word, hovering interest. It's again, it's steeped in the oppressor-oppressed narrative. It's also as was mentioned, really downplays the whole idea of agency. What is your situation? How do you unwittingly contribute? How can you help? It's all based, again, on the patient. You can't form an alliance when you're being blamed. Andrew has an amazing example that he's written about of someone who suspected maybe he didn't get a fellowship he was supposed to, and maybe there was some affirmative action involved. He mentioned it and the whole therapy blew up. That's not how you relate to a patient. It's, again, just staggering. And I'll just close by saying, in terms of this summary, that maybe one of the most pernicious aspects of the social justice therapy is that partly it's done for the gratification of the therapist, for his or her own agenda, which is, if anything, I've said before, doesn't make it malpractice. That definitely does. So,
can I jump in?
Yeah,
I think these schemas that they're using to apply to people are pathogenic. These aren't evidence-based interventions. There's not like they're totally pathogenic, and they frame just entire groups. This is, I think, really important in these all or nothing binaries. And Leslie was talking about, you go down the list of which are you? Are you the privileged or the non-privileged? And it's always an all or nothing, one or the other. They're all these all or nothing, one or the other, and it's so there's so much literature about how that all or nothing framing causes mental illness. And to impose that dynamic in the session is, not that we have research on this stuff, but it's almost certainly makes things worse. And it's shocking. I guess it's not shocking given everything else, but the people advocating these radical changes in therapeutic methodology, they don't seem interested in doing RCTs on whether or not this improves. Like they just assert it. And if you disagree, you're a bigot, and they don't need to prove that it's helping it with anything.
Can I ask Carrie? Carrie is the keeper of the Q&A. Do we have a lot of questions? Is she there?
Yeah, I
Well,
don't think we have a lot yet.
Yeah.
okay. All right. Then can I actually I have a bunch, and you guys might have questions for one another, but maybe one or all of you would like to address this notion of what I hope is a silent majority, but I'm not sure.
Well, I can
Go ahead, Suzanne.
sorry. I can speak for some of my cohort. Now, I stood out in my cohort because I was so much older than the rest of the group. But as I got toward the end of semester, I was able to start to bridge that gap a little bit. And I would say that there were a number of the students in my cohort who were not on board with that. Some of them had obviously learned about it for a long time, because at one point we were asked in class, we went around the room and there was the exercise was, who would be your nightmare client? And almost to a person, they said a bigoted white man is their nightmare client. And I said that my nightmare client would be a narcissist or a psychopath. And the professor, acted as though that was, crazy or silly to be concerned about those kinds of clients. But by the end of the semester, I had heard a few of the other people saying that, they were concerned about being called an oppressor. Particularly, there were some that to look at them, you would not think that they had a background that was from a different country, but they did, and came here in sort of a refugee sort of situation. And it just was something that was of a concern. Their beliefs were different. They were trying to keep those undercover and not talk about that. But I found that it was a significant problem. But there was also a lot of programming that had happened that would take a long time to unpack. I really felt for a lot of my cohort in that. And I learned after I left that the more they looked like me, the more terrified they were to speak out or step outside of the lines.
Yeah. Leslie, did you want to comment on that? And then Carrie, if there are questions, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Leslie, you go ahead, and we do have a bunch of questions to get to.
Okay.
So I did not have the sense that there was a silent majority that didn't agree with this. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. So I was also a little bit older, like Susanna, than the bulk of the students in my program. I was about 40 when I started the program. There were a few people my age and older, but probably most of the students were in their late 20s, early 30s, and they seemed to agree with this very easily. It was pretty shocking to me because I hadn't been in school in about a decade. I'd left law school about a decade prior, and I hadn't been exposed to academia in that intervening time, the way that people were talking. And there was this ease of fluid discussion around concepts of white privilege. And it was very normal to just open up with one's pronouns and with talking about their privilege and kind of apologizing for their privilege. And I saw this both when I was in school in an in-person program and later when I transferred to the online program, and you would be in forums and responding to one another in writing. There was an easy embrace of a lot of these concepts among most of the students. During my time in person, I did have some students who thanked me for questions that I raised in class. When I would object to something or raise a question about it, I would have people, there was a small number who did seem to agree with my perspective, although my questions were raised very respectfully and very tentatively. I didn't speak about this in this really assertive way that I've learned to, since I've learned to articulate what all this is. I was just kind of checking in about things that didn't seem to make sense. And I got thanks in the halls, and I got thanks in email, and silence in the classroom when I was asking. So I do think, yes, there are a number of people out there who are not comfortable with this, but I would not say that from my impression or from the testimonies that I get from other people in these kind of programs, it does seem like there's a large peer majority that is going along with this kind of ideology.
And they have ways, I think, in the application process too, of really screening people out who are dissidents. You have to do a diversity statement. And if you're white or a white male that has to read a particular way, you have to write basically a statement that says, as a white male, I understand that my presence is offensive to people, and some, things like that. Just to kind of, if you don't regurgitate that, you won't get in, and people who can't do that will be turned away. Lots of people don't enter these programs because they don't training.
Thank you. We're really distorting the pipeline here terribly. Carrie, thanks. And
yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you all. This is like, for us working on this, we know this is going on, but just to hear it again, and we have almost 700 people on Twitter watching. So that's great. But let's jump into a question that kind of dovetails onto what you've just been talking about. Someone asked, do you think that people with narcissistic personality disorder are taking leadership roles in these organizations and contributing to this dysfunction?
There's definitely a kind of personality disorder flavor with the kind of authoritarian tone, the aggression, the intolerance of ambiguity, the all or nothing framing. There's definitely a personality disorder flavor to the dynamics happening in these programs. I don't know that I'd go so far as to diagnose everyone as a narcissist, but there's something in that ballpark that people, I think, is there.
Yeah, well, that speaks to the splitting that you were describing, Andrew, too, that black and white thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, from my digging into the history of the different organizations, I would also hesitate to diagnose any individual, but I will say that there was a significant lack of wisdom in how these things were put together. In these meetings, particularly in the second set of meetings, which happened in 1998 in Greensboro, North Carolina, they specifically invited only people that were in agreement. And in the documents where they discuss what was decided and jobs were given out, they list people that disagreed with these ideas as obstacles to reaching their goals, which was to get a majority of counselors who believed multiculturalism as a value.
And there's also distinctive Nurse Ratched flavor to a lot of it. I felt like where it was this kind of calm, professional, this is all about including everyone kind of tone that's just spilling over with aggression under the surface and this kind of manipulative style. I don't know. There's something there.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. There's something about, I guess there would be the sort of normal guardrails in terms of being very aggressive with someone and not really caring that you might really be marginalizing somebody else. Of course, the irony of what they say that they're trying to do, or, the the fact that someone could have completely different feelings and you're making them feel very awkward. There seems to be this lack of the other side of the equation of caring. But, along those lines, when you study, what can be called the ponerology, the study of evil, there's this theory that, there's a certain percentage, 4 or 5% of people may be, again, we're not saying they're evil or sociopathic, but have a personality disorder that's very authoritarian, but it requires that they do get power. So I guess I'd like to hear from you all the other side of it where, it requires that people are going along with this too. Certainly you all are not, and you're trying to build other things and we're all trying to speak out, but it feels like we have this spiral of silence, like people aren't speaking out in these institutions and saying, wait a second, hold on here, you can't do it. There's not enough speaking out. So I guess my question would be, what is it? How do you see that part? Why are people scared to speak out, and what's it going to take to have a tipping point there? I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, we do have a lot of questions too. So
okay.
I think one thing that's really key there is social capital. There's nowhere to go. When I was attacked and I had my experiences, where do I go? Where do I meet anybody? Where do I find somebody who's like-minded? Where can I actually talk about this? And those resources just weren't available. I hope that the initiatives that we're all working on are helping to develop those so that people do have a point of contact where they can kind of get some resources and connect to other people. But that just wasn't there 5 years ago.
Yeah, someone, sorry, if I can just say, because someone has such an...
Yeah,
cool. Okay. Someone has an interesting observation here, which goes to the fact that in these kind of power dynamics, they're very, there's no stability. The categories keep shifting as far as, so in other words, there's no monolith about the oppressed. And this is a lady who says, I'm a Latina who's been subject to bias, but the worst came from a Black colleague who sought to exploit her bias to petition herself. And why not? We're human. But I again, this kind of approach makes it seem as if there's a monolithic oppressed class and oppressor. But I guess is where the intersectionality comes in, and it's very unstable and so pathological. So, Carrie, I didn't realize. I hate to switch horses in midstream, but I didn't realize how easy it was to see the questions. I have to admit.
You can just pull it up and read there.
So I guess what I'm saying is I'm perfectly happy to take that role back that I assigned to you.
That's okay. I think here I see.
Go.
Go ahead. Like Christina's asking, is there any meaningful, pushback taking place in therapy? Andrew, you kind of answered that. I mean, it seems like we have to create new things. So the Open Therapy Institute and all the work that, is going on. But is that what it's going to really take to reverse all this? I mean, do we feel that because the regulations are such, calling, regular therapy, conversion therapy, and sort of this culture of fear that these institutions aren't savable, the training programs? What do you think about that?
I think that there's a real need to change what we're doing with therapy in a big way. I mean, I think that as more people, more high functioning people are seeking therapy, the medical model doesn't make as much sense. This is me, so I'm not speaking for anybody else. I think that there's a need for a more philosophical, supportive institution, if you want to call it that, or model to help people, and to move away from some of the medical framing, the diagnostic framing, but also to move away from what we've got in our accreditation systems and in our training systems right now. And one of the things that really concerns me, I'm concerned for both the people who seek help through therapy and also for the people who are going into this field. There's a lot of really well-intentioned people who want to help others. And if you listen to Susanna's story, and there's two other that I would really recommend that I've spoken with, Amy Gallagher in the UK and Lauren Holt in the United States. These two people give really powerful testimonies to the way that they were abused in therapy programs. And I have a similar story myself. The psychological abuse that you go through if you disagree with the training is pretty intense. And for you to have to go through that to come out the other end and get a certification or license it's quite a lot to put someone through. Right now, if you do agree with the ideology and the programs, then you're gonna come out fine, but you're gonna come out propagating this ideology. But if you disagree, your choices are to stay silent and violate your own conscience, or to speak up and be called out and treated like a pariah within the program and risk being ejected from it, or some of these experiences that these people have had. Most of the people that I've spoken with who've had these treatments have left the programs that they've been in, which is effectively gatekeeping reasonable people from ending up working in this profession.
Gatekeeping was particularly brought up to me when I started having problems with a couple of members of my cohort, and it was made clear to me that if I didn't find a way to change my values or to ingratiate myself to that group, that I would be gatekept out of that. But I would like to riff on what you brought up about KCREP. I think it's important for everyone to be mindful that most of these programs are KCREP accredited, and it is the accreditation board that is specifically requiring that this kind of training to be happening in any KCREP accredited program. And I don't think that you can underestimate the power of that. There's no way for accreditors to be held accountable for that, but they have this immense power to say, this is what we want you to teach. And in counseling, they have the other end of it. There has been, over the course of this, several year period since 1988, they've worked together with the licensing board to make the KCREP accreditation a requirement for licensure, particularly in states like North Carolina, Ohio, and Kentucky. And, as part of the efforts that I am working on, if there are any counselors or clients in those 3 states that have problems with relation to this kind of counseling, I would love to hear from you, because in those states, you have to have a KCREP accredited degree in order to get a license. In about half of the rest of the states, it's conditional. That's one of the conditions, or you have to have a certain amount of coursework. But if you want to practice at the VA or in the Army, or you want to work in the State Department of the United States, you have to be KCREP accredited, which means that all of our veterans are getting this variety of counseling. I don't think that it can be understated, the potential to really undermine the foundations that were built on when you start going after those groups. And part of the work that I'm doing is to try and change that. Counseling has been very aggressive about attaching that accreditation to various privileges, like the recent effort to make it so that counselors can treat across state lines. There's a gulf there right now. And KCREP has written online letters saying to the American Counseling Association that they need to honor that. KCREP, of course, wants that privilege to be attached to KCREP accredited graduates, but the ACA has been waffling about that a little bit. But I think that that is sometimes often overlooked, that this accreditation body has a lot of power, and they're kind of hanging out in the background, and they're pulling certain strings, and nobody sees their impact unless you go digging and looking for it.
Yeah, that's similar with the medical profession too. Folks who are exercising these policy prescriptions have known that the regulatory apparatus and this accreditation apparatus is the way to do it. So I think we're seeing the fruits of their years of their labor there. Sally, do you see another question you want to answer? Also, our panelists are some other questions in there you can look in the Q&A. I mean, several of them are related to kind of what we touched on in terms of the difficulty of speaking out because there's such a high cost to it, which of course is, part of the bullies, behavior, knowing that. So I just tell people, all in your own way, coming to these webinars, all the great resources our panelists have put in to the chat section. Andrew's, new institute that he's developing, Open Therapy. There's, organizations that join to build new things. One of our questioners was asking just in psychiatry, they were bringing up, medical education, psychiatry, you do rotations that are fairly short, a month or 6 weeks. And so she was wondering if, that may play a role in exacerbating this in the sense that, students are interacting for a short period of time. So they're sort of like, I've just got to get along and get through this because I need to pass. I need to have a good score and not speaking up. I think, yeah.
The training placements, I think, in mental health tend to be longer, like year-long placements. So it's a little bit of a different model. Except for maybe the clinical internship for psychology is a little bit more like a residency. But yeah, I mean, I think going back to like there probably needs to be pretty radical structural change to salvage what's happening here. I get asked all the time if there's a program that I'd recommend for therapists, and I say, not that I know of. Not that I know of.
Yeah, and along those lines, are there inpatient psychiatric institutions that you feel are still, practicing proper, mental health diagnoses and treatment, or have you heard on that inpatient side too that this is a problem in terms of the clinicians working in the inpatient psychiatric institutions?
It's interesting about inpatient. I definitely think a lot of hospitals have a ton of this stuff. I guess I probably saw it more on the outpatient side at the hospital than the inpatient. You're doing so much crisis, and a lot of times people are in and out, and it's meds focused, and it's just a different type of work. But hospitals, I've seen a lot at different hospitals in New York.
What I've heard is that I don't know how rampant this is, but it's not unheard of. It's just that trainees, this is in training hospitals, but if they are, when people are psychotic, they say all kinds of things that are just to say impolitic. So if someone is, offended by a comment that someone who's, desperately ill says in the throes of a delusion or just disinhibited, that they actually will say things like, I don't think I can work with this person. And I want to say, have you heard of the Nuremberg Convention? I mean, you work with enemy combatants, and this is a sick person. And the fact that it's bad enough that that's even asked, but it's entertained and they're excused. I don't know how often. I just know that happens. So that's certainly worrisome. Carrie, one of the questions that actually someone asked me to ask is how can, if someone wants to find a therapist, how might they go about that? Because you never know who you're going to get, other than go to OTI.
Other than Open Therapy Institute, which is a great resource that everybody should.
Yeah, Open Therapy is a great resource, and we want you to go there because you're really doing the right thing by trying to build out that network. Leslie, I know you know some other resources too. If you want to share, please.
Yeah, I would say that there's some good directories out there. Genspect has a directory, I believe. So does Therapy First. Those are fantastic resources. CTA, you can email CTA. They have an internal directory.
Critical
So
therapy antidote.
That's Critical Therapy Antidote. So those are good. But I would say above all, know that if you're going to be speaking with a therapist, you want to trust them to be somebody that you can speak openly and frankly with. So don't beat around the bush. You can ask these questions when you meet somebody. Ask them openly, because if you can't be open enough to ask them what their stance is on these things that you're concerned about, if you are concerned about them, then there's no need to go in and invest in trying to build a relationship, because you're going to have to trust this person if you're going to be open with them.
Yeah, and it can really impact the therapy more than maybe some people think, to kind of just say, well, I'm just going to shut off that part of myself and not talk about it in therapy. It can be really derailing to the therapeutic process. So I'd agree with what Leslie's saying.
Yeah. Yeah. If you start down the road of lies and you're participating in the whole lying culture, it's not going to work for therapy, and it's not going to work, for trying to course correct here and rebuild and help patients, but also help trainees, so yeah, that there are more and more resources out there, which is really we see this vast change that is it's in the wrong direction, not a healthy direction, but there are many great things going on out there, as witnessed by these wonderful people on this panel. So
I think openly asking too is a way to exert a sort of market pressure on the people that you are interested in seeing, because if you can politely but openly ask, can you tell me what your stance is on social justice ideology, and you can kind of delineate this and get their take on it, and then you decline to see that person, they will hear that maybe not all the prospective clients out there agree with this. And so it's a way to put a little bit of market pressure on the whole system.
Yeah, I would add that there are also other avenues, particularly for things that, may be smaller issues, but there is peer support out there. There are support groups that don't have, that are more loosely organized. And there are also religious leaders who do some sort of pastoral counseling. There are other ways that you can find that. There's also coaching, and there probably will be other professions. If what is happening right now can't be dislodged from the institutions, there will have to be a different outlet created for this kind of help that is evidence-based on therapies that are known to work. So I would say stay tuned, at least in part, to see what happens over the next few years.
Yeah.
Evidence-based. Great.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sally. Yeah.
No, Ellie, Leslie, did you want to speak? Okay, please.
Oh, well, I have a few things, but I'll wait and see what the questions are.
Well, the questions are a lot of statements, actually. And is there some way for us to keep them so that folks can see them? But yeah. And so I think, actually, I like Suzanne said, stay tuned. I was going to say, well, that's a great point to end on, because we'll probably be back in a few years to see how OTI is going and everything else. But if you want to make the final comment, please do, Leslie.
Okay, well, I will say, I just want to, something that Susanna mentioned earlier about the way that she was talked to, and the way that her cohort were asked to open themselves up as if they were in therapy themselves. This is very much the way that my program ran, and the way that the other programs that I'm hearing from students about are running. So you're kind of informed that this process is going to be an opening up. You're going to have to reveal a lot of yourself. You're going to be doing a whole lot of hard work. And as you do that, you are exposing and making yourself very vulnerable to the kinds of manipulations and abuses that can happen in these kinds of situations. So this is I can't overstate what a painful process it is to be put through this kind of psychological abuse at the hands of an authority that you have paid into, and you're sitting in front of a whole crowd of people who agree with the authority figure. This is a really difficult process. And I encourage people to go and listen to the stories of people who have been through this. And to, another point that Suzanne made about military veterans being treated by CACREP accredited therapists, and a lot of new CACREP accredited therapists. The other thing I would point out is that they are putting a lot of these people into schools. So there's been a lot of increased funding for therapists and counselors in the school setting, in the K through 12 setting, and especially with a lot of attention to mental health in young people after COVID-19 and the lockdowns. There's a big push to get more kids in front of more counselors, and the counselors that you're getting are the counselors who are trained in these programs. So I think there is reason to be really concerned about the state of therapy right now. And I'm glad that you are taking the time to call this to attention.
And we'll print out all these. People did take time to make some comments, and we can keep them and maybe respond in person, because I don't want them to feel that we're not paying attention to them. But I think the time-wise, we're kind of there. Yes, Carrie?
Yes, I mean, you are all welcome to talk longer if you so please, but we can also end. I mean, we've got almost 1,000 people on Twitter listening
Oh my goodness.
to you all, which is absolutely fantastic. But yes, up to you, Sally, if you all want to say just a few, closing comments, and we definitely can save all these statements too and respond.
Yeah.
respond to
Well, I
them.
guess I'll just
Yeah.
sum up with the general gist of so many of these comments is the pseudoscience that's being waged. Questions about what we can do, which I know we've touched on. All your efforts are great. It almost never seems like enough, but pointing this out, describing it, and the implications is, Leslie was just saying about, the tentacles and how they're going into schools and, and VA hospitals, and is really unhealthy. So I'm actually thinking on the fly here that, we should definitely follow up, maybe even less than within a year or so. And almost focus on, what kinds of strategies, what other strategies, Suzanne, I mean, not to, prolong much, but what happened when you spoke to the council, the statesman, state house representative that you approached? And we can end after Suzanne. Is that good? Because we have for 60, actually we told folks 60 minutes. So, with a little seepage. So Suzanne, can you just update us on that as the last comment? Susanna? I don't know if she's
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of interference here in the playback, but I think that you asked what happened when I talked to my state representative.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, what I have learned in the state of Tennessee is lawmakers are slowly becoming aware of situations. There are some that are very aware and very concerned. There are others that are aware but are reluctant to take action. And I think that a lot of them, what they need is they need to hear from their constituents that this is a concern. People need to make their voices heard, and they need to make them heard directly to their lawmakers. You always want to be respectful when you reach out, because the lawmakers are people, and they're trying to work in what is often a difficult situation. But if people want to see changes, they have to let their lawmakers know what they're upset about and what they want. And just make your voices heard. Reach out to your local state lawmakers, your senators, directly, and say what you want so that they know. Because the more voices that they hear, the more they feel like they have the support to take action. Because there are a number right now that I think feel like there's not enough support, active support to take action. And when they start hearing from people that, yes, they do have that support, they will take action. And, you know, when they don't, you can always vote another way and be vocal about that. You know, people really do need to act with the power that they do have, and their power is their voice to say what they want, and then vote accordingly later.
Good action item, really important. And you're right. I've done a little work with these folks, and they are responsive when a number of people do, especially when all those people who are in opposition, so to speak largely with one voice. And I think we all are. It's easy enough, sadly, to identify all the discrepancies from standard and proven therapy that are going on, and how hurtful it is also to the trainees. And I think your points about how they're really managing to carve away the people who are more open-minded and ask good, challenge the status, what's becoming the status quo. It's really quite pernicious, and something that I thank you all, because folks have to know about this. For those who already have a exposure to it, and on either side, as a patient, we didn't talk about the patient experience at all, maybe some other time, but they're either about to go into this situation or they're in the midst of it, to know that they're not alone, and there are possible ways to handle this, and at least colleagues to who can commiserate with them is all very useful. So we'll do more, to be continued. And thank you, Carrie, so much. Sorry about this Q&A dance here, but thanks so much, and all of you, for watching.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.